Look at that museum piece trying to keep up with real fighters. The cocky voice crackled through the radio frequency as sleek F-16 fighting falcons soared in perfect formation across the Nevada desert. Someone should tell Grandma that air shows are on weekends. But when the morning sun hit that weathered aircraft just right, revealing the faded numbers on its tail, the laughter died instantly. Those weren't just digits painted on metal. They were a legend written in vapor trails and victory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Who was the pilot behind the stick of that battered jet? And what secret did those worn numbers hold that could silence an entire squadron of America's finest fighter pilots? Captain Jessica "Raven" Thompson adjusted her oxygen mask as she listened to the chatter from the F-16 formation flying 2,000 feet above her. At 38 years old, she had heard every variation of these comments before. The young hotshots in their pristine fighting falcons always had something to say about her aircraft, a modified F-4 Phantom that looked like it had been pulled from a Cold War museum and somehow convinced to fly again. The morning briefing at Nellis Air Force Base had been typical. Joint training exercise between multiple squadrons designed to test interoperability and tactical coordination. Jessica's lone F-4 had been assigned to play the role of aggressor aircraft, essentially a target for the F-16 pilots to practice their intercept techniques against. What the mission planners hadn't mentioned in the briefing was exactly why this particular F-4 had been chosen for the exercise, or who would be flying it. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus "Viper" Rodriguez led the F-16 formation with the confidence that came from flying the most advanced multi-role fighter in the Air Force inventory. His wingman, Captain Sarah "Falcon" Williams, First Lieutenant David "Hawk" Anderson, and Captain Michael "Eagle" Foster, represented the new generation of fighter pilots. Young, aggressive, and supremely confident in their technological superiority. "Raven, this is Viper Lead." Rodriguez's voice came through Jessica's headset with barely concealed condescension. "Hope you can keep that antique airborne long enough for us to get some decent training time. We'll try not to embarrass you too badly out here." Jessica keyed her microphone with calm professionalism. "Copy that, Viper Lead. Don't worry about me. Just focus on your own flying." The F-4 Phantom had first taken to the skies in 1958, making it older than some of the grandparents of the pilots now mocking it. By modern standards, it was a flying dinosaur, a massive twin-engine beast that relied on raw power rather than finesse. Its angular design and distinctive nose gave it an aggressive appearance, but compared to the sleek lines of contemporary fighters, it looked primitive and outdated. What the F-16 pilots saw was an aircraft that belonged in the Smithsonian, not in active combat training. The F-4's radar systems were analog where theirs were digital. Its avionics were mechanical where theirs were computerized. Its weapons systems required manual calculations where theirs provided automated solutions. In every measurable way, their F-16s represented 4 decades of advancement over the lumbering Phantom. "Check out the smoke trail from that old bird," laughed Captain Williams over the squadron frequency. "Thing's probably burning oil and leaking hydraulic fluid. I'm surprised it passed its pre-flight inspection." Lieutenant Anderson joined in the commentary. "My grandfather flew one of those in Vietnam. He told me they called them flying bricks because they had about as much grace as a construction material. At least bricks don't need afterburners to stay in the air." The mockery continued as the formation began their approach to the designated training area. The F-16 pilots discussed their advanced radar systems, precision-guided munitions, and fly-by-wire controls with the enthusiasm of children showing off new toys. Everything about their aircraft represented the cutting edge of military aviation technology. Jessica's F-4, by contrast, required constant attention from its pilot. No computer systems to compensate for pilot error, no automated flight controls. To maintain stability, no heads-up display to provide critical information without looking down at instruments. Flying the Phantom was like wrestling with a barely controlled explosion. It demanded skill, experience, and an intimate understanding of how aircraft actually behaved in the three-dimensional environment of air combat. "Raven, you still with US back there?" Captain Foster's voice carried obvious amusement. "Your aircraft's so old. I'm worried it might forget how to fly and just fall out of the sky. Maybe we should call this off before someone gets hurt." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. These pilots had grown up with video games and computer simulations. They had learned to fly an aircraft that practically flew themselves, with systems that prevented mistakes and provided constant feedback about aircraft performance and tactical situations. The idea that someone could effectively operate a fighter aircraft without these technological aids seemed almost impossible to them. Jessica maintained her course and altitude with the steady precision that came from thousands of hours in various aircraft types. The F-4 might have been old, but it was still a formidable machine in the hands of someone who understood its capabilities. Its twin engines provided enormous power. Its large radar could track multiple targets simultaneously, and its weapons load capacity exceeded that of most modern fighters. But none of that mattered to the F-16 squadron. They saw an old aircraft with an aging pilot who had probably been assigned to this mission as some kind of make-work project, someone to keep the old-timers feeling useful while the real pilots handled the important missions. "Attention all aircraft, this is Nellis Control." The air traffic controller's voice interrupted the chatter. "Training exercise Alpha 7 is now active. All aircraft proceed to designated coordinates and begin exercise parameters." As the formation adjusted course toward the training area, the F-16 pilots continued their discussion about the outdated opposition they would be facing. Their conversation revealed not just dismissive attitudes toward older aircraft, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what air combat actually required. They talked about their aircraft's advanced radar as if detection range was the only factor that mattered in air-to-air combat. They discussed their precision-guided weapons as if hitting a target was simply a matter of having the right technology. They compared thrust-to-weight ratios and turning capabilities as if air combat was a video game where the best specifications automatically guaranteed victory. What they didn't discuss was the human factor, the pilot's ability to think tactically, to understand not just how their own aircraft performed, but how their opponent's aircraft might behave under different conditions. They didn't talk about the experience needed to recognize patterns in combat situations, or the intuition required to anticipate an enemy's next move based on subtle changes in flight behavior. Jessica listened to their confident predictions about how quickly they would dispose of their easy target and allowed herself a small smile. These young pilots were about to receive an education in the difference between flying an aircraft and fighting in one. They were focused on technology and specifications, but air combat had always been about much more than having the newest equipment. The training area stretched across hundreds of square miles of empty Nevada desert, providing ample space for high-speed maneuvering without endangering civilian populations. Mountains rose in the distance, creating natural boundaries and radar shadows that experienced pilots could use to their advantage. The airspace was carefully controlled and monitored, allowing aggressive training scenarios that would be impossible in more populated areas. As the aircraft approached their starting positions, the radio chatter continued with increasing bravado from the F-16 squadron. They discussed their planned tactics with the casual confidence of pilots who had never faced a truly challenging opponent. Their strategies relied heavily on their technological advantages, superior radar, longer-range weapons, and advanced electronic countermeasures. "This should be over in about 5 minutes, predicted Lieutenant Anderson. "Probably less if that old bird can't even maintain formation speed." Captain Foster agreed enthusiastically. "I'm calling dibs on the kill shot. My targeting computer could probably lock onto that whale from 50 miles away." The dismissive attitude extended beyond just the aircraft to its pilot as well. Though they knew Jessica's call sign was Raven, none of them had bothered to learn anything about her background or experience. In their minds, anyone assigned to fly such an outdated aircraft couldn't possibly pose a serious challenge to modern fighter pilots and state-of-the-art equipment. Jessica checked her instruments one final time as the exercise began. Every gauge, every switch, every control surface responded exactly as expected. The F-4 might have been old, but it had been meticulously maintained and upgraded over the years. More importantly, she knew this particular aircraft better than the F-16 pilots knew their own machines. "All aircraft, exercises now live," announced Nellis Control. "Good hunting." The hunt was about to begin, but the predators and prey might not be exactly who the F-16 squadron expected them to be. Jessica Thompson's journey to this moment had begun 20 years earlier at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. She had been one of only 12 women in her graduating class to receive pilot training assignments, fighting against institutional skepticism and proving herself at every step. Her instructors had questioned whether women possessed the physical strength and mental toughness required for combat aviation. But Jessica had graduated second in her flight training class and first in tactical thinking exercises. Her early years as a pilot had been spent flying transport aircraft and training missions, carefully building flight hours while waiting for opportunities to transition into fighter aviation. The military bureaucracy moved slowly, especially when it came to expanding roles for female pilots. Each assignment required proving herself again to new commanders who viewed women in cockpits as experimental rather than operational. The breakthrough had come during Operation Desert Shield in 1991, when personnel shortages forced the Air Force to accelerate its integration of women into combat roles. Jessica had been among the first female pilots assigned to fly combat missions in the F-4 Phantom, an aircraft that the Air Force was already beginning to phase out in favor of newer designs, while her male colleagues received assignments to the latest F-15 Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons. Jessica found herself mastering an aircraft that many considered obsolete. The assignment had initially felt like a setback, a way of keeping women pilots away from the most prestigious missions while technically meeting integration requirements. But Jessica had approached the F-4 with the same methodical determination that had carried her through every previous challenge. She studied its systems until she could troubleshoot problems by sound alone. She practiced emergency procedures until her responses became automatic. She learned to coax performance from the aging aircraft that surprised even veteran Phantom pilots who had been flying it for decades. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The F-4 Phantom II had been designed in the late 1950s as a fleet defense interceptor for the Navy, intended to shoot down Soviet bombers before they could threaten carrier battle groups. Its massive engines, powerful radar, and heavy weapons load made it formidable in its intended role. But the aircraft had proven adaptable to missions far beyond its original design parameters. During the Vietnam War, the Phantom had been pressed into service as an air superiority fighter, ground attack aircraft, and reconnaissance platform. Its versatility came at the cost of specialization. It wasn't the best aircraft for any single mission, but it could perform multiple roles adequately. This flexibility had kept it in service long after more specialized aircraft might have been retired. The particular F-4 that Jessica now flew had been extensively modified and upgraded over its decades of service. Advanced avionics had been retrofitted into the analog cockpit. Modern radar warning receivers had been integrated with original electronic systems, and structural modifications had been made to extend the aircraft's service life. The result was a hybrid machine that combined old-school flying characteristics with carefully selected modern capabilities. Most importantly, this aircraft had been used for specialized training missions that required specific performance characteristics. Its role as an aggressor aircraft in training exercises meant that it needed to simulate the flight characteristics and capabilities of potential enemy aircraft. The modifications weren't designed to make it more like modern American fighters, but to make it behave like the aircraft that American pilots might face in actual combat. Jessica had spent years learning not just how to fly this aircraft, but how to fight in it. She understood its limitations intimately, the way its heavy weight affected turning performance, how its large radar signature made stealth impossible, why its fuel consumption limited mission duration. But she also knew its advantages, the raw power available from its twin engines, the devastating effectiveness of its weapons when properly employed, and the psychological impact of facing an opponent who seemed to ignore conventional tactical wisdom. The training programs that had shaped Jessica's tactical thinking were fundamentally different from those experienced by the F-16 pilots now dismissing her aircraft. Her generation had learned air combat during the transition period when Vietnam War veterans were still active instructors, passing on hard-won lessons about the difference between textbook tactics and survival in actual combat. These instructors had emphasized that air combat was ultimately about decision-making under extreme pressure. Technology could provide information and expand options, but victory still depended on a pilot's ability to process complex tactical situations faster and more accurately than their opponent. The best aircraft in the world was useless if its pilot made poor decisions or failed to recognize fleeting opportunities. Jessica's training had included extensive study of air combat history, learning from the successes and failures of pilots who had faced life-or-death situations in the skies over Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East. She had studied the tactics of legendary aces, understanding how they had achieved victory despite often flying inferior aircraft against numerically superior opponents. The F-16 pilots, by contrast, had been trained primarily on simulators and in carefully controlled training scenarios. Their experience was extensive but narrow. They knew their aircraft's capabilities thoroughly, but had limited exposure to the kind of adaptive thinking required when facing unexpected situations or unfamiliar opponents. Their confidence was built on technological superiority and standardized procedures. They had been taught that modern weapon systems and advanced avionics provided decisive advantages that could overcome almost any tactical situation. While this was often true, it also created a dangerous assumption that victory was automatic when flying superior equipment. Jessica's approach to air combat had been shaped by a different philosophy. She had learned to view her aircraft as a tool whose effectiveness depended entirely on how skillfully it was employed. An inferior aircraft in the hands of a superior pilot could defeat a superior aircraft flown by someone who relied too heavily on technological advantages. This perspective had been reinforced during her deployment to Bosnia in the mid-1990s, where she had flown combat air patrol missions in support of NATO peacekeeping operations. The mission requirements had been complex, maintaining air superiority while avoiding international incidents, protecting ground forces while respecting rules of engagement that changed frequently, and demonstrating American resolve while minimizing the risk of escalation. These missions had taught Jessica that real-world air operations were far more complicated than training exercises. Political considerations affected tactical decisions. Intelligence was often incomplete or contradictory, and mission success required adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. The pilot who could think beyond their immediate tactical situation and understand the broader strategic context had significant advantages over those who focused only on aircraft performance parameters. The contrast between Jessica's experience and that of her opponents extended beyond just flying time and training methods. She had operated in environments where mechanical reliability was uncertain, communications were degraded, and support systems couldn't be taken for granted. Every flight had required contingency planning and the ability to adapt when primary systems failed or situations evolved unexpectedly. The F-16 pilots had grown up with highly reliable aircraft, sophisticated maintenance support, and comprehensive mission planning systems. Their aircraft rarely experienced significant malfunctions, their communications were crystal clear, and their missions were supported by extensive intelligence and logistics networks. While this reliability was valuable, it also meant they had limited experience dealing with the kind of degraded conditions that Jessica considered routine. As the training exercise began, these different backgrounds and experiences would soon create a stark contrast in how each pilot approached the tactical situation. The F-16 squadron saw a straightforward scenario where superior technology should produce predictable results. Jessica saw an opportunity to demonstrate that air combat remained fundamentally about pilot skill, tactical thinking, and the ability to turn apparent disadvantages into unexpected advantages. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything the younger pilots thought they knew about modern air warfare and the role of technology in determining victory. They were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who doesn't play by the rules they expect. The initial engagement began exactly as the F-16 pilots had predicted. Their advanced radar systems locked onto Jessica's F-4 from maximum range, painting her aircraft with targeting information that should have ended the exercise before it truly began. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez coordinated his squadron's approach with the precision of a textbook intercept, positioning his aircraft for what appeared to be an inevitable victory. "Raven is locked up," announced Captain Williams with satisfaction. "Target bearing 090, range 40 miles and closing." "This is almost too easy." First Lieutenant Anderson chimed in with obvious enthusiasm. "I've got a tone on the target." "Permission to engage?" Rodriguez maintained professional discipline, despite his confidence. "Negative, Hawk. We'll get close to visual range first. No point in wasting simulated ordnance on something this straightforward." The F-16 formation executed a perfect pincer movement, with two aircraft approaching from the front quarter while the other two positioned themselves to cut off any escape routes. Their tactics were flawless according to current Air Force doctrine, designed to maximize their technological advantages while minimizing any possibility of the target aircraft. Maneuvering into an advantageous position, Jessica watched the tactical display in her cockpit as the F-16s maneuvered into their attack formation. The aging radar in her F-4 couldn't match the resolution and range of their systems, but it provided enough information to understand their intentions. More importantly, her experience allowed her to recognize the pattern they were following and anticipate their next moves. Instead of attempting to evade the initial intercept, Jessica did something that surprised the F-16 pilots. She turned directly toward the lead aircraft and accelerated. The F-4's massive engines pushed the heavy fighter to speeds that seemed impossible for such an old design, closing the range between opposing aircraft far faster than Rodriguez had anticipated. "What the hell is she doing?" Anderson's voice carried confusion rather than amusement for the first time in the exercise. "She's flying straight at us. That's not tactics, that's suicide." Captain Foster, monitoring from his position on the flanking formation, offered his analysis. "Maybe she doesn't understand the scenario. Someone should explain to Grandma that this isn't a chicken contest." But Rodriguez was beginning to recognize that their opponent wasn't behaving according to their expectations. The direct approach eliminated the range advantage that his formation had been counting on, forcing them into a close-quarters engagement where their technological superiority would be less decisive. "All Vipers, maintain formation," he ordered. "Don't let her dictate the terms of this engagement." Jessica's tactical gamble was based on understanding both her aircraft's capabilities, and her opponent's likely responses. The F-4's raw power and acceleration could compete with modern fighters in short bursts, particularly when opponents weren't expecting aggressive maneuvering from such an apparently obsolete aircraft. More importantly, she was forcing the F-16 pilots into the kind of close-range visual combat where pilot skill mattered more than radar range or computer-assisted targeting. In a beyond visual range engagement, the F-16s held overwhelming advantages. But in a knife fight, experience and tactical intuition could overcome technological superiority. The first indication that this exercise wouldn't proceed as planned came when Jessica suddenly reversed her approach, pulling her F-4 into a climbing turn that should have been impossible for an aircraft of its size and weight. The heavy fighter clawed for altitude with surprising agility, disappearing from the F-16's targeting solutions as it climbed into the sun. Where did she go? Williams demanded, her confidence beginning to show cracks. I lost radar contact. Anderson searched his display frantically. She just vanished from my scope. How does something that big just disappear? The answer lay in Jessica's understanding of her aircraft's radar signature and the tactical environment. The F-4's large size made it visible to radar at long range, but its angular design created radar shadows at certain angles, combined with the sun's position and the mountainous terrain below. An experienced pilot could use these characteristics to break radar lock and disappear from enemy tracking systems. Rodriguez found himself in the unfamiliar position of having lost contact with his target despite having superior detection equipment. His formation's careful positioning had been designed for an opponent who would behave predictably, trying to evade detection while seeking escape routes. Jessica's aggressive approach had disrupted their tactical plan and forced them into a reactive posture. Spread out and reacquire, Rodriguez commanded. She can't have gone far. But Jessica had done more than just break radar contact. Her climbing turn had positioned her F-4 above the F-16 formation, giving her the altitude advantage in the visual combat arena they were now entering. From this position, she could observe their movements while remaining difficult to detect. Against the bright sky above, the psychological impact of losing their target began to affect the F-16 pilot's performance. They had entered the exercise expecting to demonstrate their superiority over an obsolete opponent, but instead found themselves searching for an aircraft that had seemingly defied the laws of physics and radar detection. This doesn't make sense, Foster muttered over the radio. That flying museum shouldn't be able to do what we just saw. Captain Williams attempted to regain control of the situation. She got lucky with one maneuver. Let's not get rattled by beginner's luck. But Jessica's next move eliminated any possibility that luck had been involved. She dove out of the sun, directly toward the F-16 formation, her aircraft's engines screaming as she built up tremendous speed in the descent. The attack came from exactly the direction that the F-16 pilot's own training had taught them was most dangerous: high, fast, and out of the sun. The F-4 materialized on their radar screens like a ghost becoming solid, closing distance so rapidly that the F-16 pilots barely had time to react. Jessica's simulated gun camera locked onto Lieutenant Anderson's aircraft for the 3 seconds required to register a kill before she flashed past the formation and disappeared again into the complex terrain below. "Hawk is down," Anderson announced. With disbelief, how did she get behind us? We had her completely surrounded. The engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes, but the confident predictions of the F-16 squadron had already been proven wrong. Not only had their opponent refused to be an easy target, but she had turned their own tactical advantages against them and achieved the first kill of the exercise. Rodriguez struggled to maintain control of both his formation and his emotions. "Reform on me. This isn't over yet." But the damage to his pilot's confidence was evident in their radio communications. The easy victory they had anticipated was turning into a humbling lesson about the difference between flying advanced aircraft and understanding air combat at a fundamental level. Jessica's tactics were revealing the limitations of their training and assumptions. They had learned to fight opponents who would behave according to established patterns, using conventional tactics that their technological advantages could counter effectively. But they had never faced someone who understood their capabilities well enough to neutralize them through unconventional approaches. Viper lead. This is Nellis Control. The air traffic controller's voice interrupted their tactical discussion. Exercise parameters remain active. Continue engagement. The message was clear. This wasn't a fluke to be dismissed, but a legitimate tactical defeat that required a response. The F-16 squadron would need to adapt their approach if they wanted to succeed against an opponent who clearly understood air combat better than they had given her credit for. As the aircraft maneuvered for the next engagement, the dynamics of the exercise had fundamentally changed. The F-16 pilots were no longer facing the target to be easily dispatched, but a skilled adversary who had already proven that experience and tactical thinking could overcome apparent technological disadvantages. Rodriguez coordinated his remaining 3 aircraft for another attempt, but the easy confidence that had characterized their initial approach was gone. They were now fighting someone who had demonstrated capabilities that challenged everything they thought they knew about air combat hierarchy and the decisive importance of flying the most advanced equipment. The confrontation was escalating toward a level of intensity that none of the F-16 pilots had anticipated. And Jessica had only begun to demonstrate what 3 decades of combat flying experience could accomplish when combined with intimate knowledge of both her own aircraft's capabilities and her opponent's likely limitations. The second engagement began with the F-16 squadron attempting to implement lessons learned from their initial failure. Rodriguez had reorganized his formation into a more defensive posture, with greater spacing between aircraft and multiple escape routes planned for each pilot. They would not be caught off guard again by unconventional tactics from their supposedly inferior opponent. "Stay sharp, everyone," Rodriguez commanded as they maneuvered into position. "She got lucky once, but luck doesn't last forever. We know what she's flying, and we know what it can do." Captain Williams had been analyzing the tactical data from their first encounter, trying to understand how Jessica's F-4 had achieved such surprising performance. "Viper lead, I'm seeing some anomalous readings from that Phantom. The acceleration and climb rate don't match standard specifications for that aircraft type." Lieutenant Anderson, still stinging from being the first pilot eliminated, offered his own theory. "Maybe it's been modified beyond normal parameters. But it's still just an old F-4. We've got this." What none of the F-16 pilots realized was that their radio communications were being monitored not just by Jessica, but by a much larger audience. In the control tower at Nellis Air Force Base, Colonel Patricia Morrison, the base commander, had been observing the exercise with growing interest. Something about the tactical performance of the F-4 was triggering memories from her own flying career. "Sergeant Reynolds," Colonel Morrison called to her communications specialist, "pull up the complete aircraft registry for that F-4. I want to see its full service history." Technical Sergeant David Reynolds accessed the base's aircraft database, expecting to find routine maintenance records and training assignment logs. Instead, his computer screen filled with classification warnings and access restrictions that indicated this was no ordinary training aircraft. "Ma'am," Reynolds said, with obvious surprise, "this aircraft's records are mostly classified. I can see basic identification numbers, but the operational history is restricted at levels above my clearance." Colonel Morrison felt a chill of recognition as she processed this information. She moved to her own computer terminal and entered her command-level access codes, bypassing the standard security restrictions that had blocked the sergeant's inquiry. What she found made her hands tremble as she read. Through service records that she hadn't seen in over 2 decades, aircraft tail number 741649, call sign Ghost Rider. Operational theater, Persian Gulf, 1991. Mission classification, Beyond Top. Secret, pilot, Captain Jessica Thompson, call sign Raven. The colonel's face went pale as the full magnitude of what was happening in the skies above Nellis became clear. The F-16 pilots weren't engaging a training target or an obsolete aircraft flown by a routine pilot. They were facing one of the most legendary combat aircraft in Air Force history, flown by the pilot who had made it famous. Meanwhile, Captain Foster was positioning his F-16 for what he believed would be a successful intercept of Jessica's F-4. His aircraft's advanced radar had reacquired the target, and he was maneuvering for an attack run that would redeem the squadron's reputation after their earlier failure. Viper 4 has tone, Foster announced with satisfaction. Target locked, ready to engage on your command. But as Foster closed distance with his target, the afternoon sun shifted position just enough to illuminate the F-4's tail section clearly for the first time since the exercise had begun. Through his aircraft's targeting system, the faded numbers painted on the Phantom's vertical stabilizer came into sharp focus. 741649. Foster's confident expression changed to confusion as he stared at the numbers displayed on his heads-up display. Something about that particular combination seemed familiar, like a half-remembered song or a face glimpsed in a crowd. Then recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Jesus Christ," Foster whispered, his voice barely audible over the radio frequency. "Viper 4, say again," Rodriguez demanded. "Are you engaging or not?" Foster's hands had begun to shake as the implications of what he was seeing registered in his consciousness. Viper lid ... tail number. That's 741649. The radio frequency fell silent as the other F-16 pilots processed this information. To most military aviators, aircraft tail numbers were just administrative details, random combinations of letters and numbers used for identification and record keeping. But certain tail numbers transcended mere identification to become legend. "Negative." Anderson's voice came over the radio with obvious disbelief. "That can't be right. Check your instruments." But Captain Williams had also maneuvered into position where she could see the V-4's tail markings clearly. "Confirm 741649, she said, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and fear. "It's definitely Ghost Rider." The significance of that identification spread through the F-16 formation like an electric shock. Every Air Force pilot knew the stories about Ghost Rider, though many had dismissed them as typical military folklore. Exaggerated tales that grew more impressive with each retelling. But the aircraft designation was real, documented in official records that were classified at levels most pilots would never access. Rodriguez felt his tactical confidence evaporating as he realized what his squadron had been engaging. "All Vipers, this is lead. Break off the attack and reform on me immediately." "Why are we breaking off?" Anderson demanded. "It's just a tail number." "That's not just a tail number," Williams explained, her voice tight with tension. "That's the F-4 that penetrated Baghdad air defenses during the opening hours of Desert Storm. The aircraft that flew missions were so classified, they're still sealed after 30 years. Foster, who had been closest to the legendary aircraft, was struggling to process the implications of what he had discovered. The stories ... they were all true. The impossible mission profiles, the targets that couldn't be reached, the tactics that violated every rule of air combat. It was all real. The psychological impact of this revelation was immediate and profound. The F-16 pilots had entered the exercise believing they were facing an obsolete aircraft with a routine pilot. Instead, they had been engaging one of the most famous combat aircraft in military history, flown by the pilot who had made it legendary. In the control tower, Colonel Morrison was reviewing classified mission reports that detailed exactly why tail number 741649 had become famous. The aircraft had flown deep penetration missions into heavily defended airspace, achieving objectives that conventional aircraft couldn't reach and surviving damage that should have been fatal. More importantly, she was reading about the pilot who had been responsible for those achievements. Captain Jessica Thompson had not just flown Ghost Rider through impossible missions. She had developed the tactics and techniques that had made those missions possible. "Sergeant Reynolds," Colonel Morrison commanded, "get me a direct line to the exercise controller. This training scenario needs to be terminated immediately." But before the colonel could intervene, Jessica's voice came over the radio frequency. For the first time since the exercise had begun, her tone was calm, professional, and carried the quiet authority of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than a training exercise. "Viper Squadron, this is Raven," she said simply. "Perhaps we should discuss the tactical lessons learned before we continue." The offer was couched in diplomatic language, but its meaning was clear. The legendary pilot was giving the younger aviators an opportunity to withdraw gracefully from an engagement they were not prepared to continue. Rodriguez struggled to find words that would maintain his squadron's dignity while acknowledging the reality of their situation. They had not just been outfought by a superior pilot. They had been engaging a living legend without realizing it. "Raven, this is Viper Lead," he replied, his voice carrying new respect. We weren't aware of your aircraft's operational history." Jessica's response was characteristically understated. "History is just the foundation, Viper Lead. The real education comes from understanding why that history was made." The revelation had fundamentally altered every aspect of the training exercise. What had begun as a routine mission to test F-16 capabilities against a target aircraft had become an unexpected encounter with military aviation legend. And the F-16 pilots were beginning to understand that their real education was just beginning. Revelation of Ghost Rider's identity had created a moment of stunned silence over the radio frequencies. But Jessica understood that recognition alone wouldn't provide the education these young pilots needed. Real learning required demonstration, and she was about to show them techniques that couldn't be found in any flight manual or simulator program. "Viper Squadron," Jessica's voice carried across the airwaves with calm authority. "Let's reset the exercise parameters. I'll give you one more engagement opportunity, but this time I want you to observe what you're seeing, not just react to it." Rodriguez found himself in the unprecedented position of receiving tactical instruction from his supposed target. "Raven, are you suggesting a training demonstration instead of combat exercise?" "I'm suggesting you learn something that might save your lives in real combat," Jessica replied. "Modern air warfare isn't about having the best technology. It's about understanding how to use whatever technology you have more effectively than your opponent uses theirs." Colonel Morrison, monitoring from the control tower, made the decision to allow the demonstration to continue. Her own combat experience told her that the F-16 pilots were about to receive training that was worth more than months of conventional instruction. Jessica positioned Ghost Rider at the center of the training area and began a series of maneuvers that defied everything the F-16 pilots thought they knew about the capabilities of 1960s-era aircraft. The F-4 began a climbing spiral that should have bled off energy and left it vulnerable, but instead seemed to accelerate as it climbed. "Watch the energy management," Jessica explained over the radio as she executed the maneuver. "Your F-16s are designed for efficiency and computer-assisted flight control. But sometimes the most effective tactic is controlled inefficiency, deliberately wasting energy in ways that create tactical advantages." Captain Williams attempted to follow the F-4's flight path with her own aircraft, but found herself falling behind despite having superior thrust-to-weight ratio and more advanced aerodynamics. How is she maintaining that climb rate? "The physics don't work." "The physics work fine," Jessica's voice came back with a hint of amusement. "You're just thinking about them wrong. Your aircraft wants to fly efficiently because that's how it was designed. Mine was designed to be a weapon, not a fuel-efficient transport. Sometimes being inefficient is exactly what you need." Jessica demonstrated her point by suddenly reversing the climbing spiral into a diving attack that brought Ghost Rider down on the F-16 formation from an impossible angle. The maneuver violated basic energy management principles, but it positioned her aircraft where none of the F-16 pilots had expected it to appear. Lieutenant Anderson tried to counter the attack by pulling his F-16 into a tight defensive turn, relying on his aircraft's superior agility to escape the threat. But Jessica had anticipated this response and adjusted her attack angle to intercept his escape route before he had even begun the maneuver. Your aircraft tells the computer what it's doing, and the computer tells you, Jessica explained as she achieved another simulated kill. My aircraft tells me what it's doing directly. No computer interface, no interpreted data. When you eliminate the middleman, your reaction time improves dramatically. The demonstration continued with Jessica showcasing tactics that seemed to come from a different era of air combat. She used terrain masking in ways that the F-16 pilot's radar couldn't track, appearing and disappearing from their sensors like a ghost materializing and vanishing at will. Terrain following isn't just about flying low, she explained while threading Ghost Rider through a series of desert valleys at speeds that seemed impossible for such a large aircraft. It's about understanding how radar beams interact with terrain features and how an experienced pilot can use those interactions to become effectively invisible. Captain Foster attempted to follow Jessica's route through the terrain, but his F-16's flight control systems actively fought against the aggressive maneuvering required. The computer-assisted controls that normally made his aircraft easier to fly were now preventing him from matching the performance of a supposedly inferior opponent. Your fly-by-wire systems are safety features, Jessica noted as she watched Foster struggle with his aircraft's automated responses. They prevent you from making mistakes, but they also prevent you from making choices that the computer considers suboptimal. Sometimes suboptimal choices are exactly what tactical situations require. The most impressive demonstration came when Jessica engaged all three remaining F-16s simultaneously in a close-quarters dogfight that showcased the F-4's unexpected capabilities in visual range combat. Despite being outnumbered 3-1 by more advanced aircraft, she maintained the tactical initiative through a combination of aggressive maneuvering and perfect situational awareness. Numbers don't determine outcomes, Jessica explained while positioning Ghost Rider to threaten multiple opponents simultaneously. Position determines outcomes. If you can force multiple enemies to interfere with each other's attack solutions, numerical superiority becomes numerical confusion. She demonstrated this principle by maneuvering her F-4 so that each F-16 pilot's attempt to attack her would require flying through another friendly aircraft's engagement zone. The formation that had been designed to provide mutual support instead became a tactical liability as each pilot found his attack options limited by the presence of wingmen. Rodriguez watched in amazement as Jessica turned their coordinated attack into a series of individual defensive reactions. She's not fighting 3 aircraft, he realized. She's fighting 3 separate pilots who happen to be in the same airspace. The tactical lesson was clear. Modern formations and coordinated attacks worked best against opponents who would respond according to established patterns. But an enemy who understood formation dynamics could use those same coordination principles to neutralize numerical advantages. Jessica's next demonstration focused on weapons employment in ways that the F-16 pilots had never considered. Instead of relying on her radar to guide simulated missile attacks, she used visual identification and predictive maneuvering to position her aircraft where her weapons would be most effective. Your targeting computers can calculate optimal firing solutions faster than any human pilot, she explained while achieving multiple simulated kills through techniques that bypassed electronic targeting entirely. But computers calculate based on current position and velocity. Humans can predict where targets will be based on understanding how pilots think and react under pressure. The demonstration reached its climax when Jessica invited all 3 F-16 pilots to coordinate their most aggressive attack against her single aircraft. What followed was a masterclass in defensive flying that left the younger pilots struggling to understand what they were witnessing. Jessica flew Ghost Rider through a series of maneuvers that seemed to violate multiple laws of physics simultaneously. The heavy F-4 twisted and turned through three-dimensional space with an agility that should have been impossible, avoiding attacks from multiple angles while simultaneously positioning for counterattacks. Experience teaches you to see patterns that training simulators can't reproduce, she explained while executing a barrel roll that brought her guns to bear on Captain Williams' aircraft. Real air combat is chaos management, not procedure execution. You can't train for chaos in controlled environments. The F-16 pilots found themselves completely outclassed despite having every technological advantage. Their advanced radar systems, superior missiles, and computer-assisted flight controls had been neutralized by a pilot who understood air combat at a level they were only beginning to comprehend. As the demonstration concluded, Jessica brought Ghost Rider into formation with the 3 remaining F-16s, flying wing position with the aircraft that had been hunting her moments before. The psychological impact was profound. She had demonstrated not just superior skills, but superior understanding of the fundamental principles that governed air-to-air combat. That concludes today's lesson, Jessica announced with characteristic understatement. Questions? The silence that followed Jessica's question was heavy with the weight of shattered assumptions and wounded pride. The F-16 pilots who had begun the exercise with supreme confidence in their technological superiority now found themselves struggling to process what they had just experienced. Everything they thought they knew about air combat had been challenged by a single pilot in an aircraft they had dismissed as obsolete. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying a humility that hadn't been present at the beginning of the exercise. Raven, I need to ask you something directly. How much of what we just saw was because of that specific aircraft, and how much was pilot skill? Jessica's response was characteristically thoughtful. The aircraft is a tool, Viper lead. A very good tool in the right hands, but still just a tool. What you saw was the result of understanding how to use that tool beyond its design specifications. Your F-16s are capable of everything I just demonstrated, but you'd need to override your flight control systems and ignore your training protocols to access those capabilities. Captain Foster, who had been unusually quiet since spotting Ghost Rider's tail number, finally found his voice. Ma'am, I owe you an apology that goes way beyond just today. We were completely out of line with our comments about you and your aircraft. We were judging things we don't understand. Foster, right? Jessica replied, her tone warming slightly. You don't owe me an apology for being confident. Confidence is essential for fighter pilots. But confidence without knowledge is dangerous. Today was about expanding your knowledge base. The transformation in the F-16 pilots' attitudes was profound and immediate. Captain Williams, who had been among the most vocal critics of the ancient F-4, now found herself asking detailed questions about the techniques Jessica had demonstrated. When you executed that climbing spiral, were you manually controlling engine thrust to maintain energy? Or is there something about the F-4's power plant that we don't understand? Jessica appreciated the technical nature of the question. Both, actually. The F-4's engines were designed for a different philosophy of operation than modern power plants. They're less fuel efficient, but more responsive to manual control inputs. Learning to work with those characteristics instead of against them opens up maneuvering options that computer-controlled engines can't provide. Lieutenant Anderson, still processing his early elimination from the exercise, asked the question that had been bothering him most. How do we learn to see the tactical patterns you were describing? The way you predicted our responses and positioned yourself accordingly? Experience helps, Jessica acknowledged, but more importantly, you need to study air combat from a different perspective. Your training focuses on maximizing your aircraft's capabilities. You need to also study how to minimize your opponent's capabilities, which requires understanding how they think and what limitations their equipment imposes on their tactical options. Colonel Morrison had left the control tower and was now approaching the flight line where the aircraft would be landing. She had been monitoring the radio communications throughout the demonstration and recognized that something significant had occurred, not just a training exercise, but a fundamental shift in how these young pilots understood their profession. As the aircraft touched down and taxied to their parking positions, the atmosphere on the ground was markedly different from the confident swagger that had characterized the pre-flight briefing. The F-16 pilots emerged from their cockpits with expressions of thoughtful concentration rather than casual dismissal. Jessica completed her post-flight procedures with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout her career. Ghost Rider had performed flawlessly during the demonstration, proving once again that proper maintenance and understanding could keep even vintage aircraft operating at peak capability. Rodriguez approached Jessica as she secured her aircraft, his manner respectful in a way that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Captain Thompson, I'd like to request permission to debrief this exercise with you in detail. My squadron needs to understand what we just experienced. Of course, Jessica replied. But first, let me ask you something. What do you think your pilots learned today? Rodriguez considered the question carefully before responding. I think we learned that we've been confusing technology with capability. We assumed that flying the most advanced aircraft automatically made us the most capable pilots. Today proved that assumption wrong. The debriefing session that followed was unlike any that the F-16 squadron had ever experienced. Instead of analyzing equipment performance and technical specifications, they found themselves discussing the psychological and tactical aspects of air combat that were rarely addressed in formal training programs. Jessica began by addressing the fundamental misconception that had shaped their initial attitudes. Modern fighter aircraft are incredibly sophisticated machines that can do amazing things, but they're designed to be operated within specific parameters by pilots who follow established procedures. Real air combat often requires operating outside those parameters and abandoning established procedures. Captain Williams raised her hand tentatively. Are you saying that our training is inadequate? I'm saying your training is incomplete. Jessica clarified. You've been taught to maximize your aircraft's capabilities, which is important. But you also need to understand how to adapt when your aircraft can't perform optimally, when your systems fail, or when you face opponents who don't behave according to your expectations. The discussion that followed revealed the depth of knowledge that the F-16 pilots had been missing. Jessica explained concepts that weren't covered in their technical manuals: how to use aircraft limitations as tactical advantages, how to read an opponent's intentions through subtle changes in flight behavior, and how to maintain situational awareness when electronic systems provided conflicting or incomplete information. Lieutenant Anderson asked about the terrain-following techniques Jessica had demonstrated. How do you calculate the radar masking effects without computer assistance? You don't calculate them, Jessica explained. You learn to feel them through practice and experience. Radar shadows change based on altitude, angle, and terrain features. After enough flying time in different environments, you develop an intuitive understanding of where you can hide and where you'll be exposed. Captain Foster inquired about the energy management principles that had seemed to violate basic physics. When you executed that climbing attack, conventional wisdom says you should have lost airspeed and become vulnerable. Instead, you gained a tactical advantage. How is that possible? Jessica's explanation revealed the complexity of real-world air combat tactics. Conventional wisdom assumes that both pilots are trying to optimize their aircraft's performance according to standard parameters. But if you're willing to accept short-term disadvantages in exchange for long-term tactical positioning, you can force your opponent into situations where their optimization becomes a liability. The educational value of this session extended beyond just tactical techniques. Jessica was teaching the F-16 pilots to think about air combat as a dynamic, three-dimensional chess game where psychological factors mattered as much as technical capabilities. The most important thing you can understand about air combat, she told them, is that it's fundamentally about decision-making under extreme pressure. Technology can provide information and expand your options, but victory still depends on making better decisions faster than your opponent. Colonel Morrison observed the debriefing from the back of the room, recognizing that her base was witnessing something rare and valuable. The kind of knowledge transfer that Jessica was providing couldn't be replicated in simulators or classroom environments. It required direct experience with someone who had faced life and death situations and learned from them. As the formal debriefing concluded, the F-16 pilots found themselves seeking additional opportunities to learn from Jessica. What had begun as a routine training exercise had become the foundation for a fundamental reevaluation of their approach to air combat and their understanding of what it meant to be truly proficient fighter pilots. The transformation was complete. The pilots who had started the day mocking an ancient aircraft and its old-timer pilot now recognized that they had been in the presence of expertise that transcended any single aircraft or technology. They had learned that mastery in air combat was about much more than flying the most advanced equipment. It was about understanding the timeless principles that governed success in aerial warfare, and they were eager to learn more. 3 weeks after the encounter with Ghost Rider, Nellis Air Force Base had become a different place. The story of the F-16 squadron's humbling experience had spread throughout the military aviation community, not as gossip or entertainment, but as a case study in the importance of respecting experience and understanding the deeper principles of air combat. Colonel Morrison had implemented immediate changes to the base's training protocols. The encounter with Jessica Thompson had revealed critical gaps in how modern pilots were being prepared for real-world combat situations. The over-reliance on technology and standardized procedures had created a generation of aviators who were technically proficient but tactically limited. "We've been teaching our pilots to operate aircraft," Colonel Morrison explained to a gathering of senior officers from across the Air Force. "But we haven't been teaching them to fight in aircraft. There's a fundamental difference that this incident made clear. The first major change came in the form of mandatory heritage flights, training exercises where modern fighter pilots would fly alongside restored vintage aircraft operated by veteran pilots. These weren't nostalgic demonstrations, but serious tactical training designed to expose younger pilots to different approaches to air combat. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez had volunteered his squadron to be the first to participate in the expanded Heritage program. The experience with Jessica had convinced him that his pilots needed exposure to perspectives that couldn't be provided through conventional training methods. "We're not trying to turn back the clock," Rodriguez explained to his pilots during a briefing. "We're trying to understand principles that transcend any particular generation of technology. The fundamentals of air combat haven't changed just because our aircraft have become more sophisticated." Captain Williams had become the most enthusiastic advocate for the new training approach within the squadron. Her encounter with Jessica had sparked an interest in aviation history and tactics that went far beyond her previous focus on technical specifications and performance parameters. "I've been reading mission reports from Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm," she told her wingman during a planning session. The pilots who achieved the most success weren't necessarily flying the best aircraft. They were the ones who understood how to adapt their tactics to exploit their opponent's weaknesses while maximizing their own advantages. The impact of Jessica's demonstration extended beyond just Nellis Air Force Base. Video recordings of the exercise had been classified and distributed to Air Force training commands worldwide as educational material. The footage showed clearly how a skilled pilot in an older aircraft could neutralize the advantages of modern technology through superior tactical thinking. Flight schools began incorporating new curriculum elements focused on adaptive tactics, techniques for operating effectively when standard procedures failed or when facing unexpected opponents. The emphasis shifted from memorizing responses to developing the ability to analyze situations and create solutions in real time. Lieutenant Anderson had requested additional training time with Jessica, recognizing that his early elimination from the exercise had resulted from fundamental misunderstandings about air combat dynamics. "I was flying my aircraft according to its specifications," he reflected, "but I wasn't thinking about how to use those specifications to achieve tactical objectives." Jessica had agreed to serve as a special instructor for selected pilots, but only under specific conditions. She insisted that the training focus on principles rather than procedures, understanding rather than memorization, and adaptability rather than standardization. "Technology will continue to evolve," she explained to her first class of students. "The aircraft you're flying today will be obsolete in 20 years, just like mine supposedly is now. But the mental skills required for air combat, situational awareness, tactical thinking, decision-making under pressure, those don't become obsolete. They just get more important as situations become more complex." Captain Foster had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all the F-16 pilots. His initial arrogance had been replaced by genuine curiosity about the historical development of air combat tactics. He had begun studying the evolution of fighter aircraft design, not just to understand technical improvements, but to comprehend how different design philosophies reflected different approaches to aerial warfare. "Every aircraft represents a set of compromises," Foster explained during a presentation to junior pilots. "Modern fighters are optimized for specific mission profiles and threat environments. But understanding how previous generations of aircraft achieved success despite their limitations teaches us how to succeed when our current technology reaches its limits." The psychological impact of the encounter had been as significant as the tactical lessons learned. The F-16 pilots had been forced to confront their own assumptions about the relationship between technology and capability. This realization had made them more effective pilots, but it had also made them more thoughtful about their profession and its history. 6 months after the exercise, the Air Force released a comprehensive study analyzing the training value of heritage flight programs. The data showed measurable improvements in tactical decision-making, situational awareness, and adaptability among pilots who had participated in multi-generational training exercises. More importantly, the study revealed that pilots who had been exposed to vintage aircraft and veteran instructors showed greater resilience when facing unexpected situations or equipment failures. They had learned to rely on fundamental flying skills rather than depending entirely on automated systems. Jessica's influence extended beyond just military aviation. Civilian flight schools began incorporating similar principles into their training programs, recognizing that the lessons about adaptability and fundamental skills applied to all forms of aviation. The emphasis on understanding aircraft behavior at a deep level, rather than just following standardized procedures, improved safety and competence across the entire aviation community. The restoration and preservation of Ghost Rider became a priority project for the Air Force Museum system. The aircraft was recognized not just as a piece of historical hardware, but as a platform for continuing education about the evolution of air combat tactics and the importance of preserving institutional knowledge. Colonel Morrison received approval to establish a permanent combat heritage center at Nellis, where vintage aircraft would be maintained in operational condition and used for ongoing training purposes. The center would serve as a bridge between different generations of military aviators, ensuring that hard-won tactical knowledge wouldn't be lost as technology advanced. "We almost made a critical mistake," Colonel Morrison reflected during the center's dedication ceremony. "We were so focused on moving forward that we nearly left behind essential knowledge about how to succeed when moving forward isn't possible. Combat doesn't always allow you to use your equipment optimally. Sometimes survival depends on making suboptimal equipment perform beyond its design specifications." Jessica continued flying Ghost Rider in training exercises and demonstration flights. But her role had evolved from just being a pilot to becoming a keeper of institutional knowledge. She worked with aircraft manufacturers to ensure that new fighter designs retained the flexibility and pilot authority that had made older aircraft effective in the hands of skilled operators. "The goal isn't to build aircraft that can't be flown incorrectly," she explained to a gathering of aerospace engineers. "The goal is to build aircraft that can be flown correctly by pilots who understand the difference. Automation should enhance pilot capability, not replace pilot judgment." The young F-16 pilots who had been humbled by their encounter with Ghost Rider became some of the most effective instructors in the Air Force. Their experience had taught them that true expertise required humility, continuous learning, and respect for knowledge that might come from unexpected sources. Years later, as they advanced to senior positions within the military, they would ensure that future generations of pilots understood the lessons they had learned in the Nevada desert. The encounter with Jessica Thompson and Ghost Rider had become more than just a training exercise. It had become a foundational experience that shaped their understanding of what it meant to be professional military aviators. The legacy of that single exercise continued to influence Air Force training doctrine for decades. It served as a reminder that in a profession where lives depended on split-second decisions and tactical excellence, wisdom was more valuable than technology, experience was more important than equipment, and the most dangerous mistake was assuming that newer automatically meant better. Some lessons can only be learned through direct experience with those who have faced the ultimate test of combat. Jessica Thompson and Ghost Rider had provided that experience, ensuring that essential knowledge would be passed on to future generations of fighter pilots who would face challenges that no amount of technology could solve without the wisdom to use it effectively. The ancient F-4 Phantom and its legendary pilot had proven that true mastery never becomes obsolete. It just becomes more precious as time passes and fewer people possess it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.